foolish optimism persists like Cervantes' Don Quixote chasing windmills, maybe you will fall in love again. Maybe I'll fall in love again. Well, maybe not. Maybe she'll come along again, that girl I thought I forgot. Maybe she will appear once more. Well, maybe not. Time has gone by, yet she's somewhere hidden in my heart. Yesterday she'd loved me. Did we lose that magic kiss? Did our love melt away like a winter's snowy mist? Maybe love faded away like a photograph in the summer sun. Maybe love is just a silly plot, or maybe not. Yesterday she loved me. Did we lose that magic kiss? Did our love disappear like a winter snowy mist? Maybe love faded away like a photograph in the summer sun. Maybe love is just a silly plot, or maybe not. Maybe not. I'm hoping maybe not. Hello again. The word maybe does evoke a whole slew of potential possibilities, and this is particularly applicable to neurosurgery, for, as my wise mother used to say, always expect the unexpected. And this leads one to think ahead of the potential consequences of anything that could possibly go wrong during a surgery, so that you can make an immediate adjustment to correct your path. And since you are working in the confines of a living human body, you simply have to keep a cool head and a steady hand to be able to counter any obstacle or glitch on the way. Now, I have a couple of stories here that I'd like to illustrate that really things like this can't be made up. And these are actual stories that happen to people. The first story involves about a 60-year-old black man that came in again on a Saturday night in a coma. This also was before we had the MRI or CAT scan neurodiagnostic studies. I examined him and I saw that he was in a coma. His right pupil, as in another patient we talked about, was dilated and non-reactive, which is a very serious situation. The only history I had from him, from his family, was that he was diabetic and he was hypertensive. In other words, he had high blood pressure. So I did do an arteriogram on him, and I felt that there was a blood clot where he had bled from one of the vessels in his brain, and the right posterior aspect of his brain, in the occipital lobe into the calcarean fissure, again in this visual system that we talked about once before. Well, he was seriously ill, and since I was a resident at that time, I had to check all the cases with my attending neurosurgeon, who was a very experienced gentleman, very smart. He actually knew the neurosurgical literature better than anybody else, chapter and verse. I called him and explained the situation, his response to me, "Well, Dr. Stopak, for what you're describing, it sounds like he's hopeless." And when I heard that, I responded, "You know, as long, Dr. So-and-so, as he's hopeless, I think I'm going to operate on him." And I hung up the telephone. At that point, I instructed all of the hospital staff, nurses, and to help me get him up to the operating room as soon as possible. So I pushed him on the gurney into an elevator, got him up to the operating room, and put him on the table. We did intubate him. I had an anesthesiologist handy, and I started the surgery on the posterior aspect of his right skull and head. I opened up the scalp and made a generous bone plate opening, and I came down onto the brain. At this point, my attending doctor did show up for the surgery, as he was obliged to. And now don't forget, it was a Saturday evening, and a lot of times doctors don't like to be disturbed on a Saturday evening, and they don't have the same feel if they're at home as the person who's actually doing the examination. I had a hunch about this gentleman, and the first words that my attending said to me were, "Why are you doing this? I didn't give you permission. Your judgment is terrible, and I'm going to have you expelled from the program." I said, "Yeah, I know, but you know, I'm right in the middle of this now. I could use a hand. Could you help me get through it?" So he did help me get through it, and I came upon a big intracerebral hematoma, or blood clot, just where I thought it was going to be, and evacuated it. Almost immediately, the brain decompressed and started pulsating to the heartbeat normally. We controlled the bleeding and then closed up the surgery. He did stay in a coma for about 3.5, 4 weeks, but he did wake up. And when he woke up, what he had was what's called, I think I described in a similar patient, a homonymous hemianopsia, where he lost half the vision in each eye, which one can survive very well with that particular disability. Anyway, he left the hospital, and I thought that was the end of it. A couple of months later, I got a telephone call from this man who happened to be a reverend. And he calls me and says, "You know, Dr. Stopak, when I got sick that Saturday night, I was preparing my sermon for a new black church that I was opening up in the inner city of Baltimore in a really rather poor section. I want to tell you that I have finished that preparation, and I'm giving that sermon this Sunday, and I certainly would enjoy the presence of you and your family if you can make it." I said, "Reverend, you know I'm going to be there." So that Sunday morning, we got in the car. My 2 children from my first marriage at that time were about maybe 7 and 5 or 7 and 4, something like that. And we drove over to Baltimore and then found this little church. When I got to the church door, the sun was behind me. When I opened the heavy and decorated church doors, the light was kind of shining behind me, and immediately I saw the minister on the pulpit. He was a typical Southern Baptist, very exuberant, spirited minister, waving his hands and shouting up on the pulpit. However, when he saw me, he raised his hands and he said, hold it. I'm not President Nixon, and I don't have an entourage of doctors taking care of me, but my doctor is here today." And with that, everyone looked around, and I humbly accepted the acknowledgement, and we went to 4 seats that he had in the front row. Well, I am Jewish, and I never took communion before, and I did take it at that time. Went up on the pulpit, on the stage, and he gave me the wafer, and I took communion and then whispered in his ear, "Reverend, you're doing great, but please don't get so excited. I don't want to have to go through this again." Anyway, this was a nice story of, again, always expecting the unexpected. The next story is pretty incredible. I'm going to take the liberty of reading some of this just to keep all the facts straight. But as I recall, this was a 40-year-old carpenter who was working directly over a 4-inch thick wood plank using a 12-inch circular steel saw to shorten their lengths. The sharp circular saw cutting blade suddenly snapped out of its retaining base harness while swirling at its optimum power and speed revolutions, and it took off in a vertical upward direction to its landing dead center into the carpenter's head and face, smack in the midline, inserting from the top of his forehead right down over the base of his right down to the bridge of his nose, and then right through his nose from in the middle of one narine to the next. So it was between his eyes even. You're going to have to paste this together, Mitch. And it actually split the bridge of his nose, lips, and chin and mandible. Finally, when it lost inertia, it came to rest only millimeters from the surface of the terrified brain itself. When I saw him in the emergency room from the side, he looked like, quote, Dick Tracy, end quote. This view was extraordinary to grasp a man's usual profile with at least 6 inches of a steel circular saw protruding from his head and face. Further inspection did indeed reveal that the unwelcome projectile was so firmly ensconced, settling snugly as above described. The patient was miraculously fully conscious and otherwise unharmed neurologically. The surgical removal of the offending saw involved an elaborate tactical plan to extricate the surgical removal of the offending saw involved an elaborate tactical plan to extricate the blade with very deliberately and precisely placed self-retraining. Jesus. The surgical removal of the offending saw involved an elaborate tactical plan to extricate the blade with very deliberately and precisely placed self-retaining instrument retractors, walking them down millimeter by millimeter to the depths of the gaping wound, eventually freeing the encased metal invader, and at the same time controlling bleeding or hemostasis. We used microbipolar coagulation forceps at every advance in this approach. The final challenge was to reconstruct and secure the facial and skull bone separations with small metal plates and to perform plastic surgery closure over the length of the surprisingly clean edges of the head and face. We were rewarded with an excellent recovery both clinically and cosmetically, with the carpenter resuming his usual lifestyle.